This week, I'm revisiting the jar you may have seen me throw and trim a few weeks ago. I left it just turned and waiting for a bisque firing in the electric kiln, which is what you can see me packing now. At this stage, the pieces are bone dry, and for pots like the taller lidded jar that are typically a bit bigger and thicker, I let them sit out drying for a few weeks or place them above the heater so they can thoroughly dry out before being fired to 1000 degrees Celsius. As when you fire clay that's still damp, that's when pots can potentially explode. If you'd like to watch part 1 and 2 of this process, I'll leave links to these videos down in the description below. I go over the throwing and the trimming in great detail, discussing the why and how, together with drawing a few illustrations along the way to further explain a few more of the subtleties. But for now, let's get back to packing the kiln with all the larger, bone-dry pots I've been making recently. In this dry state, the pots are the most fragile they'll probably ever be. They're almost like thin, dried mud, and it can be extraordinarily easy to chip them or even crack them if you squeeze the pots too hard. So when I handle these pots and place them inside the kiln, it's always a very delicate procedure. Even just setting them down has to be done with care, as placing them in abruptly could cause the base to chip. But despite the fragility, you can stack the pots up quite dramatically, and they should be fine, provided you don't knock one pot against another. This bisque firing process changes the clay into ceramic, hardening and strengthening the material, whilst also making it porous, which is necessary for when I glaze these pots. A few days later, after the kiln has been fired to 1000 degrees Celsius and has then cooled down, it can be unpacked. The pots are now brighter in colour, and I can pick them up in ways I would have never dreamed of doing before. Yet the material still is fragile, especially compared to how strong stoneware and porcelain can be when fired to 1300 degrees Celsius, which is the temperature they'll be taken to in the next firing. Before I glaze the pots though, certain parts of them need to be waxed. This is an emulsion I use from Pottery suppliers. I keep mine watered down slightly so it brushes on more smoothly, and it's brushed onto any area I don't want to be glazed, such as the underside of the lid and the base and rim of the jar. This acts like any other wax resist, and once dry it seals the clay, meaning liquid won't be able to pass through it. So, when this pot is dunked in glaze, it won't be able to adhere to these parts. Very simply put, glaze is a whole collection of raw materials mixed and suspended in water. When pots are dipped into glaze, the water gets absorbed into the clay body and the raw materials that have large particles remain in a layer on the surface. The water itself will then evaporate over a couple of days, leading to the glazed surface becoming a bit more fragile, but also, at least with this glaze, it becomes easier to tidy up. I'm very careful as I work not to spill any wax on the rest of the pot, but if it does happen, there are a number of things you can do to correct it. You can scrape much of the wax off and then sand that area, or you can blast it with a heat gun, a paint stripper, until the wax melts off and evaporates. Or if you are doing another bisque firing, you can just place the pot back inside for another go up to 1000 degrees Celsius, and once unpacked again, there'll be no remnants of where that wax was. It's for this same reason that you don't have to worry about removing the wax prior to the glaze firing, as it's all going to burn and melt off anyway. The last thing I do is dab a bit of extra wax over my maker's mark, just to make sure it's really properly sealed. I then pour any leftover wax back into the bottle so nothing gets wasted, and I clean the brush with very hot, soapy water. The two previous videos show the creation of one of these jars, but in actuality I've made two, one of which I'll be glazing with this white felspathic crackle glaze, whilst the other will be coated with the pale green variant, which in terms of recipe is exactly the same as what's in this bucket here, save for the addition of 1% red iron oxide. When these glazes aren't used for a couple of months, the raw materials settle in the bottom, and I have to give them a very thorough mix, so the mixture is completely even, with no slight skim of water on the surface. You might also notice that I've placed one bucket inside another. I do this as when I push the body of the jar into the glaze, any displacement is caught instead of wasted. I haven't glazed many large pots like this, so I'm still learning how to do it best. I found that dipping first the outside and then the inside leaves me with the cleanest, most uniform surface, so let's give this a try. Thank goodness for the extra bucket, and I should note that it's given a really good clean prior to this, as this white glaze especially would be very easy to contaminate. I plunge the jar in really quickly. This way no single part of the vessel stays submerged for much longer than any other. I then set the jar aside and I twist it in place numerous times to get rid of any glaze left on the foot. The lid is altogether easier to glaze, but there are a few things I do in order for it to be coated properly. The lid is plunged in, twisted, lifted out and then put back in. This way I don't catch a pocket of air as the lid is placed underneath, as that would result in a bare patch on the underside of the lid. Then, as it's lifted out, I use the very slightly concave top of the lid, like a spoon, to scoop out extra glaze that then settles in this hollow. It's carefully set aside, the tongs pried off, and that's the two components glazed for now. Although the body of the jar does need a layer inside, but I won't do that until the outside has dried fully. The sooner I scrape the excess glaze back into one of my buckets, the better, as this stuff dries quickly. For the other jar, I'll be using this glaze, which is exactly the same as the white, but with 1% red iron oxide, which will cause it to turn a pale green once reduction fired. Again, it's mixed thoroughly, and then the body of the jar is plunged quickly into it, right up to the rim. Now, the reason I do the outside first, rather than the inside, is quite glaze specific. Once dry, this feldspathic glaze becomes quite powdery and very fragile, and if I were to glaze the inside first and then glaze the outside by plunging it in like I do, there's a good chance I could damage the interior glaze with that motion. So I prefer to do it this way round. Giving the pot time to dry out between coats is really important too, as the porous ceramic walls of the pot have drawn in a lot of water after being glazed, and they're pretty much saturated. This means that if I were to attempt to glaze the inside as soon as the outside layer was dry, the walls of the pot would still be saturated with water, which means inside, as no more water can be taken into the walls, only a very thin skim of glaze would end up adhering to the interior, if anything. And in all likelihood, the entire pot would become completely oversaturated and the glaze simply won't dry, resulting in glaze that flakes and cracks off the pot before it's even been fired. With all of that said, I usually wait 1 or 2 days before coating the insides. And I can tell when the pots are ready when they no longer feel very damp and cold, and the colour of the glaze on the outside has lightened dramatically as the moisture has left it. I then pour glaze inside, trying my best not to let any drip on the outside surface. It's then swirled around to coat the bottom, and then very slowly and evenly poured out. The waxed rim really helps the glaze pour out neatly, without dribbling back on the exterior shape, and I'm very gentle with my hands on the outside as I rotate the pot around, as if I were to grip the jar too much or let my fingers drag on the surface, the glaze could easily be damaged and thin spots created, which can be rather difficult to notice, and they often come back to haunt me after the pot has been fired and the entire piece is set in stone. The reason for the awkward looking pour is due to the fact I'm trying to do this so delicately, without squeezing the pot too hard or moving it too quickly. If glaze does cascade on the outside a little bit, I won't try and fix it straight away. Rather, I wait until the entire piece is dried out, and that's when I do any tidying up. As if I try and touch up the surface at this point if I do make a mistake, it somehow always ends up looking worse. So it's something I tend to do the day after, once everything's been given time to dry out. A few days later, I can begin tidying up the glazed surface. I tend to use sharp metal kidneys, knives, and my fingertips for this process, scraping back any drip to make a flush surface, and then I rub it over very gently just to make it uniform. Again, I need to be careful not to gouge too much away, as it's very easy to overdo it, and it's always a pain trying to patch up sections of the glaze, then waiting for them to dry, and then fettling them flush once again. On larger pieces like this, I find this process of refinement very pleasing, as I know the better and neater the surfaces at this stage, the better the pot should look once fired, so I take my time. I work slowly and I make sure it's right. Together with rubbing over any drips, I also smooth over any large craters I find, or random specks in the surface, and even very faint splits in the glaze, which, if these cracks are only faint, smoothing them over won't create any issues, and they tend not to show once the pot has been fired. I then take a sponge soaked with water to remove any glaze that's settled on the waxed portions. I sometimes do this job on the wheel, but with larger pots it's easier to stay within the lines, so I do it on a banding wheel, like so, removing the glaze bit by bit and washing out the excess glaze that clogs the sponge often, as otherwise it doesn't remove it quite so well. My aim when neatening the top is to make the line where glaze meets clay as neat as it can be. Then, to do the base, I flip the pot over onto a pad of foam before doing the exact same task on the lower half of the pot. The base is always the most important part to get right, and even though this piece was waxed, you can see just how much glaze ends up sticking to it, and all of it needs to go. As I beveled this outer edge, I can use it as a guide almost to slice a very even line through the glaze that encircles the bottom. Anything left inside the footwell is then gouged out, and then I go back over all of it with a wet sponge, so that it's as pristine as it can be, as if any glaze is left on this lower section, it could stick the pot to the kiln shelf when it's fired, potentially destroying the pot and damaging the expensive kiln furniture it's fired upon. For some reason the wax really did a terrible job on the lid, and it required a huge amount of tidying up. Work that's done over a basin of water which catches any excess glaze dust, which I can eventually then recycle back into the larger buckets you saw earlier. With the glaze all cleaned up, the pot is almost ready to fire, but first I have to prop the lid up slightly using wadding, which is this material, made from 50% kaolin and 50% coarse alumina hydrate. And if you'd like to learn more about this material, I created a whole video about it, how it's mixed, how it's used, and how it's removed post-firing. I'll leave a link to that on screen now and in the description below. As I had quite a number of pots to wad, I began by rolling out a long coil, which I then cut into smaller pieces in groups of 5. For larger lids, I may use more, or simply larger waddings to prop the lid up, but essentially, by using these I can fire both the jar and the lid together, as opposed to separating the two components and firing them separately in different parts of the kiln. This saves space, guarantees that the two parts will match one another, as sometimes in a reduction-fired kiln, the atmosphere can differ slightly in certain areas, resulting in different colours here and there. And when the lid is propped in place, it actually helps the rim of the jar to stay nice and round, as at such high temperatures there is a chance that pots can warp, especially their rims, if placed directly next to one of the burners inside the kiln. The wadding material sticks nicely to the wax, and after all 5 have been attached, I lower the lid, slotting it into place in such a way that the lid is hovering over the jar, and no two parts are actually touching, save for the wadding in between. This stuff tends to dry out very quickly, so after each use I spray it liberally with water, then shove some plastic sheeting tightly over it, and then seal the bucket with an airtight lid. The next step is to squeeze as much of this into my gas kiln as possible. The more densely they can be loaded in, the more cost efficient each firing is, and it also makes achieving a strong reduction atmosphere easier, as there's simply less space for oxygen to occupy. I'll be placing both of these jars on the uppermost shelf. This is typically where it gets hottest, and as a result the glaze effects can end up looking rather brilliant, although I'm bordering a dangerous line, as at 1300 degrees Celsius, this clay body will begin to slump where I've trimmed it thinly. And although the pots look rather large and fill the space nicely at this stage, once fired and fully shrunk, there'll be a lot of space around them. Each pot is placed carefully in with about 2 or 3 millimeters between them. As for this firing, they absolutely cannot touch, otherwise they'll stick and fuse together. The 3 colourful spikes you saw me place inside are called pyrometric cones. These melt and bend over at very specific temperatures, measuring the effective heat on ceramic over time. It's through these that I know when it's time to switch the kiln off, and when all 3 are bent over, like so, with cone 10 that melts around 1290 degrees, just about touching cone 9 in the middle. It's important to give the clay and glazes time to mature during the firing, and this often means sustaining certain temperatures for longer periods of time, and that's exactly what these measure. During the firing itself, I can see these through spy holes in the door, and it always takes a bit of adjustment to get their position just right, so they're easily viewable even when the internal temperature is white hot and swirling with flames. With the kiln fully packed, it can be lit the following morning. I usually start at about 7 AM on the dot, and the entire process takes about 8.5 hours. During the early stages of the firing, I raise the temperature gradually, as pushing it quickly is never a good idea. Once 860 degrees Celsius is reached, I start the reduction. I do this by increasing the gas pressure and air pressure and sliding the dampers that cover the flues to about halfway closed. This causes the fuel inside to burn inefficiently, as the gas builds up and there's simply not enough oxygen inside. As a result, oxygen is stripped away from the clay and glazes, pulling iron out to the surface as it does. And it's this process that creates the greens and blues in my glazes. If I fired them in a fully oxidized atmosphere, like what's found in my electric kiln, these same glazes would fire to rather mottled yellows and browns, which aren't nearly so nice. As the temperature approaches 1290 degrees Celsius, I periodically tap the dampers open just a fraction so the temperature keeps rising, and then, once all 3 cones are bent over, the kiln can be switched off. I then open the dampers fully and remove the bungs and the spy holes in the door, crash cooling the kiln back down to 1000 degrees Celsius, whereupon it's sealed up properly. 36 hours later, and the kiln is now ready to unpack. The pots on the top shelves always remain hotter for longer, so I tend to unpack this kiln from the bottom upwards, and I'm simply shining this light inside to get a good look at what's going on further back in the kiln. Here's the pale green jar first. And here's that jar glazed with white, although really it's grey, borderline very pale green, but it really gets its name from how the glaze looks when it's in the bucket, I think. And here's everything unpacked from that kiln load. The next step is to grind the bases of all the pots, just to soften them slightly, as the coarse clay body can be sharp at times, so they're given a quick polish with the diamond pad, just to remove the sharp specks that might otherwise scratch whatever surface it's placed upon. There's also occasionally some white residue, which is plucked away from the kiln shelf and sticks to the clay. This has to be removed, but I don't sand the bases excessively, as if I grind too much of the surface away, I actually reveal a grey undertone, and I prefer the red-orange toastiness given to the clay via the reduction firing process. Next, all the lids need to be pried off. This is typically quite an easy process, but occasionally the lids do become more stuck and need to be carefully tapped loose. The leftover waddings can then be plucked off, and I'd like to find a way of grinding these back up so the material can be reused when I make new wadding. The last step is to polish and grind the lid in place using this stuff. This is Chemico valve lapping paste, and for a lid this size, I smear a healthy amount on the underside of the lid. Usually the coarse variant initially, before moving on to the fine stuff once the worst of any roughness has been ground away. And when I'm grinding so many pots at one time, I tend to take the paste from one pot to another and then another, topping it up with fresh paste as I go, when the old stuff becomes saturated with clay and doesn't grind away as efficiently anymore. I then slot the lid in and grind it in place. Pots this size can be a bit awkward to manage, and I do sometimes attach the lid onto the wheel and spin it like that, pushing the lower half of the jar down onto the lid. I then use toilet paper to remove the worst of the residue, as otherwise washing all of this off with a sponge can be a pain, as the carborundum grinding paste is grease-based, which means hot, soapy water works best to remove it. And here's the finished jar, although I noticed a few rough patches just underneath the rim where the lapping paste wouldn't have been able to reach. I love this iron blossom on the side, which has appeared completely at random. The glaze itself fired very evenly, and you can see the crackled quality in its surface, especially on the top of the lid where it was applied more thickly. And here are some better photographs I took of this piece, with some better lighting, to really show it off. This is one of the pots which I was exhibiting at Yorkshire Sculpture Park, which is now sold and is probably heading off to one of you, so thank you to whoever that was. And that brings this series of 3 videos to an end. If you've managed to make it to the end of each of these, thank you. All of your views, likes, comments and subscriptions go a really long way in helping support my small business. And with that, I'll see you next week.